Okay, so these are the best decks in Hearthstone for you to climb to Legend with, and I just want to throw this out there. This is not necessarily in an order, this is just the clump of decks that I personally would recommend. With that said, let's jump into it. First one is Ramp Paladin. Ramp Paladin is a very good deck. It's linear, it's got decent to pretty good late game, really good mid game. Like I said, it's linear, so it's simple to play, and it's a deck a lot of people are playing right now, so you know it's strong. It's something that a lot of people know about, so it's not necessarily like a groundbreaking or new deck, but that's okay. Sometimes you just play the thing everybody's playing because it's super strong. That being said, the limitations with this deck means that you're not really countering anybody else. You'll play against a lot of mirror matches, and if you don't really like that very much, this isn't the deck for you. Also, this deck might not be for you if you don't like cheesy decks, but if you do like cheesy decks, where you kind of just do a cool little combo turn 4-5, and then you can kind of just close the game out 5, 6, and 7, then this deck is for you. So overall, the general strategy of the deck is to basically use one of these two cards, Hyabbis, Allura, or Nosdormu, to cheese out Tip the Scales or another big minion like Scrapyard Colossus into Carnival Clown. And you just win the game from there because you have so much tempo that your opponent can't really play against that you just win, right? Because you know that you're playing for this, so you will keep higher cost cards a little more consistently, whereas your opponent doesn't. And because they don't know that, even if you give them a ton of mana, they can't make as big of a play as you can make when you play something like Nosdormu. So overall, this is just a very swingy, cheesy deck. It's definitely not for some people, but it also definitely is for others. With that said, let's jump into the next one. The next deck on this list is Weapon Aggro Rogue, basically just Aggro Rogue in general. I'm going to just throw this out there. This deck, Tempo Rogue with Whirl Kick and Stealth Rogue, wherever it is, it's up here. All really good decks that play somewhat similarly. Whirl Kick Rogue is more skill intensive, but has a higher ceiling. But Stealth and Weapon Rogue are extremely similar, with the only difference being Weapon Rogue has a little bit better mid-game with the Steel Dancer and the Dread Corsair to help you cheese out some cards, and a slightly bigger weapon. Stealth Rogue has a little bit more burst, and a few more minions that you can put on the board to do earlier damage, so it's really up to you on which one you'd want to play. I'm personally performing better with Weapon Rogue. Over the course of 2 seasons, I'm, I think, 11-2. It's not a huge sample size, but to be fair, I've been experimenting with a lot of different rogue decks, but it's still really good. Especially if you're at lower ranks and you just need to crank games out, this is probably one of the fastest decks you can play. It has a ridiculously high win rate, and it only requires one legendary, being the Doctor, and if you don't have the Doctor, you can just throw in another backstab. It's really not even that big of a deal. You don't even need the one legendary, so it's really cheap, it's effective, it's fast. And if you end up not liking this version, it's very easy to tech into Stealth Rogue, which is a slightly different deck, similar power level, and I would recommend both of them. So without further ado, let's jump into number 3. So the next deck is Zoolock, and let me just say the win rate real quick. Including last season and this season, the win rate is 52-28, which is overall a 65% win rate. So a large sample size with a good win rate proves that this deck is at least good, right? And then you have the fact that it's cheap, so anybody can make it. You have one legendary Evanlock, and it's fast. So similar to the arguments for Stealth Rogue, that makes it really good for climbing to Legend. A little bit differently from Weapon Rogue is that I think this deck has a little higher of a skill cap, because you have things you have to keep track of. You have to keep track of your health. You got to get little combos with Dark Glare. You need to know when to commit your animated broomstick to control the board. You need to do damage to yourself and heal yourself enough to make Flesh Giant cheap without using too many of your resources. And overall, this deck is really cool. Yeah, I personally like this deck. It's the deck I think I've played the most, or like the second most, so if you want to try it out, go ahead, and if not, there are a lot of other decks on this list. Okay, so the next deck is OTK Demon Hunter, and I think this has the potential to be the best deck in the game if you really learn how to play it. So this one is a deck that you will suck when you start playing it. Like, you will be really bad, but then over time your win rate will increase and become really good. Okay, so don't be afraid if your win rate starts off kind of low, because it's not that big of a deal. Also, when the new set rolls around, almost none of these cards are cycling out. Like, none of them. All of these cards are Ashes of Outlands cards or more recent, which means that this deck will be good in the meta for at least the next year. The next thing is the fact that if you learn how to play this deck, it can be one of the best decks in the game, which I already said. And I just want to give you guys a couple of tips that I've learned after going 64% win rate over this season and last season, with this season so far being 12-5. 3 main things. 1, don't be afraid to use your combo pieces to survive. Like if you're playing against an aggro deck, don't be afraid to use an early Feldscream Blast or an early Morg Artificer Emolition Aura or Morg Artificer Feldscream Blast, or to use Guardian Aug Merchant to kill off one of his minions, because all you have to do early is survive. And then once you get to the late game, the opponent will either run out of steam or you'll heal so much that they can't win, and then you don't even need your combo anymore. So that's the first thing. The next thing is don't keep too many cards in your hand, which kind of goes with don't be greedy, because that way you can get the full value out of something like Skull of Gul'dan. And then the last thing is simply just tweak the deck whenever you try to play against something of a new meta. Like if the meta is shifting and there are more weapon rogues, run 2 Acidic Swampoos. If the meta is shifting and being way more spell based, then you can run the Cult Neophyte right here, boom, to make spells cost a little bit more if you're playing against a lot of spell druids, so on and so forth. This deck is very tweakable if you want to figure out how to make it better. And yeah, I think it's a really interesting deck that you can get really good at and win a lot of games with. But again, you will start off really, really bad. So the next deck on this list is Armor Warrior, and I think it's kind of unfair to say just Armor Warrior, because I think every single Warrior deck is strong. I've played this deck, Silas, I've played Big, I've played Enrage, and I've played Bomb, and all of them have 64% or higher win rates. Bomb Warrior is 7-4, Enrage Warrior is 8-4, Big Warrior is 10-4, and this deck is 5-1, and most of the games are complete blowouts. Like, you control the board well into aggro decks and get a ton of armor. You can get a good Brawl and or Barov and completely shut down a token deck, or a deck that gets out a couple of big minions and hopes that that carries them. Silas can be used to OTK a deck like Mage or whatever early on, which is kind of important to note, right? Because OTKs gives you a very clear win condition, but it can also be used to steal the opponent's win condition. And last, if you're playing against another warrior, which you could think, oh, that's your biggest weakness, you play Rattlegore, you make a couple copies of it with a Bloodstone Mercenary, and the warrior has no way of dealing with Rattlegore because there's no silence or anything like that. So overall, this deck has a ton of win conditions. Every single warrior deck is strong right now. I don't know why it's not being played. And knock yourself out. This is probably, in my opinion, my go-to deck if I'm to continue. This or like Big or Bomb Warrior, just a warrior deck in general. So the next deck on this list is new Burn Mage, and the only reason why it's new is because instead of running the lab partner, I run a mana reservoir because it just makes the elemental allies a little bit more consistent, and it's a more durable minion. So if the opponent wants to kill it, they have to put 3 more damage into it, and it can kind of act as a makeshift taunt. That being said, this deck is also just good in general. I'm 16-8 with it. It's extremely effective. Got some cool combos. Got really good draw engines. Sometimes you got to hold on to your resources. Sometimes you need to just commit and hope that they stick on the board and try to close out the game over a couple of turns. And yeah, this deck is really strong. I love it. I played it basically the entire day on stream like 2 or 3 days ago whenever I end up posting this video. Maybe it was 4 days ago. I don't know. But I had an absolute blast playing this deck. I did not want to put it down. It felt so good because you had cool combos. You had ways of setting up for a ton of draw. Getting a giant Ross is so satisfying, doing like 4 damage to everything on the board. It feels so nice. Just mwah. It's amazing. And you also got burst. So if the opponent like looks like they're in a good spot and you can just combo them and kill them. Like, this deck is super fun. I would recommend it. Honestly, I think it's my favorite deck on the list right now. Would I say it's the strongest? No, I think this deck has a couple of like unwinnable matchups, like Warrior kind of dumpsters this, but yeah, I would recommend this deck quite heavily, and it's super duper fun. So the last deck on this list that almost didn't make it on the list at all is Gibberelling Druid, and there's an honorable mention deck that I'm going to put down there, or I'm actually going to talk about, which almost took this deck's spot. I don't think Gibberelling Druid's that good anymore. I think it's good to climb, good enough. I think that it is one of the better decks, but I still don't think it's that good because it's so easily countered. Aggro decks can kill you before you pop off, and good control decks, if your board gets wiped like 2 times, you're basically a sitting duck, right? But the reason why this deck still makes the list is sometimes there's just nothing your opponent can do. Sometimes you just Solar Eclipse, Arbor up on turn like 4 with an Innervate Lightning Bloom combo, and your opponent just has to take it. Or sometimes you play a Gibberling and you get a ton of cheap spells, you just pop off, fill the board, Power the Wild, pump them up, and then next turn give them Soul of the Forest, and there's nothing your opponent can do about it. Like, it's a very polarizing deck. You either hard lose or you hard win. And if that's the style of deck you want to play, go right on ahead. It's also super duper cheap, so it's very easy to just get, and it's relatively simple to play, although the Gibberling, being able to combo a ton of spells, can be a little bit interesting, and makes the skill cap of this deck a little bit higher than your typical normal aggro deck. But yeah, great draw engine as well. I'd say that this deck is still fine. I know I opened with it being kind of negative, and I still feel this way, but it's definitely still a good deck, and when it pops off, you just win, and it's just beautiful. Mwah. The last and honorable mention deck on this list is just Highlander Hunter. I think it goes underappreciated. I think it's a very, very good aggro deck with a little bit of flexibility, with the secrets to help you control the board a little bit better, play mind games with your opponent, like what secret is it? Not to mention that Zephyrus and Dino Tamer Brand give you a little bit of that late game win condition as well, which a lot of aggro decks lack a lot of the time. Is a Dragon Tamer Brand and the Rifle as good like mid-range options, so that way if the game does drag on to 6 or plus turns, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 cards with Zephyrus that are at least like pretty decent. Not to mention the fact that your early game is super consistent. You got a lot of 1-drops, you got a lot of 2-drops, and if you're playing into a deck that is weak to minions, like say Rogue, you can dump your board and hero power later on. Or if you're playing against something like Zoolock or Warlock that usually trades into your board but does a lot of damage to themselves or is vulnerable to that kind of damage, you can just hero power as much as possible and try to like weave in minions whenever you can. Like turn 1, minion turn 2, usually a minion turn 3, maybe a 1-drop hero power turn 4, 2-drop hero power turn 5, 3-drop hero power, and just try to extend your resources to constantly apply pressure but also constantly be pushing damage. I think that particular strategy works moderately well against decks like Mage and Warlock that don't really have healing and can oftentimes deal with minions anyway. Yeah, that's about it. I think this deck is quite strong. I would recommend you use it. It's not even that expensive. Like, you do have a couple of legendaries, but you don't really need the Rifle. You can replace that with something else or just another secret. You don't really need Pull Celt. Even though he's helpful, you can just replace him again with something like a Bone Wraith, which I personally think is quite strong, or a Hyena Alpha to synergize with secrets. And the same thing goes for the Dragonbane. You don't need it either. They're just good cards to have. So overall, you only really need Zephyrus and Dino Tamer Bran, and the rest just go with good early game tempo based plays and push damage. It's a super good deck. I love it. I like Hunter, and I'm sad to see it in such a weak spot right now, but this is a hidden gem that I would recommend you try out because nobody's playing right now.